Okay. So thank you everyone for joining. Today we want to talk about a little bit about auto deploy in ECS. And there's a lot of conversations, but I thought it would a good point to stop and talk about this synchronously so that we all don't go crazy. Um, so the motivation for auto deploy to ECS is expanding Auto DevOps to support more than just Kubernetes. We developed a template, a GitLab CI YAML template that deploys to ECS, and we wanted to connect it to Auto DevOps. Now, when we decided that we wanted to do this, we stumbled across the fact that Auto Deploy is this huge template that once we wanted to start expanding it, um, there's several issues that we needed to address. The first of them is that we didn't want anything in the Kubernetes flow to break because it's working well. So what we wanted to do in the first place was to split that out into a separate template that it gets called just like the master Auto DevOps template calls a bunch of auto build, auto deploy. So we wanted auto deploy to be also like a master template that calls a bunch of targets. So one of them would be Kubernetes. This would be ECS, and in the future we would have EC2. We can have Fargate. We can have GCP. We have a bunch of things that are not on the table yet, but this is the first time that we're touching it. So, so besides splitting out the Kubernetes template and splitting out the ECS template and having them each being called, we needed to handle the logic behind what's going to be called and when. So we have several use cases. One of them is I'm using Kubernetes, but I'm not using ECS. Another one is I'm not using Kubernetes, but I'm using ECS. Another one is I am using both. And the fourth one is I'm using none. So in the first case where I'm using Kubernetes and no ECS, I want the flow to be exactly as it is today, same behavior, not touching anything. Deploying ECS, what I want to do is be able to leverage everything we have in Auto DevOps today. So if we think about composable DevOps, which we talked in a different issue, is I can still use auto build and auto test and maybe even auto secure and everything that I have, all the beauty of Auto DevOps, but the deployment target changes to ECS. If I use both, for this iteration, we're going to skip ECS and just continue with Kubernetes. But at some point along the road, we're going to need to deal with this use case. And the fourth one, which does nothing, I want it to behave like today. So it doesn't do deploy, but it uses everything up and downstream from Auto DevOps. So that was basically the idea. And then we thought about a way to differentiate this once we wanted to expand the deployments. So we wanted to introduce a new parameter that's called launch type that a user will define where they're going to deploy to at the end of the day. And now I'm going to let Etienne continue from here.
Thanks. So yeah, as you may be aware, I've been trying to split the process so that we have like a deployment to Kubernetes and to ECS going, and it's been something that's been aimed for 13.0. So there is this MR that is going on that I started, and this MR leverages the use of a CI variable, as you most of you know about. That said, as I was telling a few people, I feel like this is like some sort of like short-term solution. After having like chatted with a holder from the configure team last week, we chatted quite a bit about it. Like if you want to go for a long-term solution, we may want to aim for a framework. This is something that holder as well hinted about at the last meeting we had about handing over tasks from the configure team onto the release team. He talked about like something which is more backend focused, and and I totally agree with that, and less CI variable. So while we have this like CI, this MR that's focusing on this the CI variable, I think it's just important to like see what are we, where are we going with this. should we actually go forward with this? Should we focus, like spend our effort on the backend solution, on the framework solution, which I think we should. We have this like backend that's only Kubernetes focused at the moment, and I think the end goal on the long term we need to have some sort of framework that's like, platform, not platform agnostic, but we shouldn't have like modules that are called clusters or Kubernetes or whatever, right? Something that which is a bit more tech agnostic. And I think this is I think as an option we should start to look at. As of the like about the MR that's going on, I feel like I've received like different suggestion about how to technically do this, and I think yeah, I'm grateful because there are like things like the dynamic child pipeline. I just knew about it, but I had never like I never dived into it, so it was like a good opportunity to look into that. But yeah, I feel like there's been like many technical solutions that have been thrown around. So I'm just like now wondering about the viability and legitimacy of this MR at this point. But I feel like this legitimacy can be revisited once we talk about the long-term solution here. Yeah, that's about what I have to say about this. One second, I'm just
So I do want to discuss some of our options and maybe what's a good option and where we're hesitant to move forward. So I'm going to share my screen so that we can see it all together. Yeah. Okay, let me look for it. Etienne, before we actually dive down into the different options written in the issue, is there a reason why DAST wouldn't work in ECS with a given proposal where we're just, splitting it to launch type?
I mean, Dast has been built with like Kubernetes in mind. I don't know Dast in details, but it would work with ECS. It's just that we need to like make it less Kubernetes focused at the moment. There are just
if I can just jump in there, I don't think Dast was designed with Kubernetes specifically in mind. It was just designed with, there had to be a deployment, and we need to know what the URL was to hit. And the only way that worked was if, with Auto DevOps anyway, that was the only way that it worked, is if you had Kubernetes. So detecting Kubernetes was a shortcut because that was the only variable to check. But I don't believe Dast has literally anything to do with Kubernetes specifically.
Okay, so I think that's I think that's part of the work is just to to test it with ECS and to remove this like Kubernetes active, or like to just convert that Dast template so that it's not Kubernetes active focused.
So I think what we just need to figure out is how to figure out the URL and send that to Dast.
Yeah.
Right, and since we construct the URL, I believe that part is trivial.
So going forward with this first iteration, do we see any problems connecting auto deploy with ECS without having the support of both Kubernetes and ECS?
No, I think it's possible, but like given the time that we have here for this iteration, I think the simplest way to move forward is just to have a split of templates at the deploy level, the deploy level, and to have, I think I like the use of rules that Shinya was putting as an example, and that's something that I try to implement in this MR. Just to leverage the rules attribute, and the rules check what CI variable has been set, and yeah, this one here, and then go for the Kubernetes template, or just to go for the ECS template.
Yeah. So basically, this rule will expand once we add additional deployment targets, correct?
That's correct. But now I think that the more long-term question is that do we want to stick with this pattern here?
So let me just first off clarify, that currently doesn't work, right? Like you don't have a conditional include capability?
No, yeah, I still need to. I'm still doing some tests on that, yeah, yesterday evening I was not able to just like make it work, and so that's one thing I wanted to check out. Is just like the condition within the include, as you're saying. I need to check that in documentation.
So that would be the engineering work to go down this path, which is a perfectly plausible, viable path, and I don't see any reason not to do that. But it is engineering work, and I think maybe what you were exploring was: is there a path that doesn't require adding, conditions to includes?
I think the path that, yes, there is one path which I explored almost a couple of weeks ago, and it's just to leverage Kubernetes active with only or exclude. To have exclude Kubernetes active when we want to use the ECS deploy template, or just to leave only Kubernetes active when we want to use the Kubernetes template. That said, the configure team, they've replaced only and exclude with rules.
Right.
So this is, I think, the way to move forward. If we can just like replace on our side the only and exclude,
Sure.
with rules. But if the conditions are not working within include, then we might need to fall back on only and exclude for now.
So let me just clarify: does only and exclude work on includes today?
I need to look at what I did 2 weeks ago, but it was working. Yes, the thing that I had done was working. I remember. No, I did include, and then I did include both templates, and then it's within the templates that I was using only and exclude Kubernetes active.
Right, right. Okay,
yes.
That makes sense. Right.
Yeah.
Because there's actually something I just said that this actually would work. I just realized that was wrong. One of the problems with the way that like that specific comment from Shinya 6 days ago, that would only work for 3 of the 4 cases that were each talked about. So specifically the case where you need both Kubernetes and ECS in the same pipeline, this would end up including both jobs. And well, depends on how you define the jobs, but if the jobs define the same, if the include files include the exact same job name, then one would overwrite the other, and you'd only be able to deploy to ECS.
Yeah, that's something I found out during this development cycle. That we cannot have the same job, the 2 jobs with the same name, right?
Right, so exactly.
That's why in the second template, which I was including, was the ECS template. I was naming the jobs review _ECS and production _ECS. But that bothered me a little bit because I feel like the job name shouldn't be referring to the platform we're aiming.
Well, it could. I mean, that's not necessarily a...
For a first
in my mind,
yeah.
I think, okay.
Well, I think the bigger challenge was simply depending on how you define things, if changing the name of the job caused a problem, then that'd be a problem. But if it's, I run it on Kubernetes and the pipeline just shows a deploy to Kubernetes, then so be it. And if I deploy to ECS, then it was a deploy to ECS. In the end, if I had, for example, staging was Kubernetes, but production was ECS, and as long as it was then, staging _ Kubernetes and production _ ECS, that's fine. I don't think that's a problem. So having the job names be different is okay, because I don't think you reference the job names in any other way, unless you use it for like conditional, like the needs keyword. If you had to refer to a job name there, that would be a problem. But As long as you just
Yeah.
refer to the stage name, then it wouldn't be a problem what the job
You would
name is called.
you wouldn't see the renaming of the review and production names to review underscore Kubernetes and production underscore Kubernetes as a breaking change. I mean, one may see that it could be a breaking change somehow, since we've been sticking with review and production as a job name for a
Well,
while.
I guess the question is, like, think it through. Right now, I don't see any reason that it would break anything. Like,
Okay.
it's a change, but it's a cosmetic change.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, because Auto DevOps itself, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, right? I'm just working through this in my head, and I haven't literally used Auto DevOps in a year, so I don't know necessarily what all the things are there, but I don't know why we would care what the job is named. What we care about is what stage it's in, and then what the dependencies are across stages. But if you just renamed the job, I can't right now see any way that it would actually break anything.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I'm just.
Unless somebody had like a cross-project pipeline that depended on it or something like that. But Auto DevOps itself wouldn't break for sure. And I doubt anybody would have a cross-project pipeline that depended on it, because we don't have, I don't know, I don't think we have that capability.
Okay. Yeah, I was just making like an assumption here because if I had all the knowledge that the configure team does have, maybe I would be more certain, and I would be able to say, hey, yes, like the job names don't matter. It's just
Right.
cosmetic. Rename them. As far as I know, the job names are checked within the test. There are some aspects where that if we have this type of pipeline, so we're making sure that we have the jobs which names are production and not review and so on, right? So if I'm
That's a
changing
really good point. The actual deploy function may very well look at the job name, and you may have to rewrite the deploy function if it depends on the job name.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Or it may even just pattern match and then like set the Kubernetes pod variables or whatever based on the job name. And so you might have to be more careful. But even so, I believe you could then solve for that by just rewriting the deploy function to now be aware of the new job name.
Yeah.
But it's possible to make it consistent and not break it, is the point.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
So I think, so if I'm just gonna jump ahead because I don't think we have a lot of time. I feel like there's one of the biggest concerns was simply, is it a requirement that we support deploying to multiple targets in the same pipeline? And if you want to relax that for 13.0 and say, look, we only support all ECS or all Kubernetes, that's a perfectly rational constraint if that makes it radically easier. The challenge is if then you go down a certain path that then paints you into a corner that then makes it really, really hard to get back out of, and you can't ever then support both. So if an extra hour of thinking about how to make it work to support both means that you go in the right direction, then definitely do it. But if it takes too long, definitely relax that constraint. And so again, like this example that you're screen sharing right now, like this would be a perfectly fine next iteration. And then later on, you're like, okay, now we've got to push it down a level, and we've got to have the job names, make sure that both jobs can survive at the same time. Given that we have environment-specific variables, and that is in core, I believe. I think we moved it to core a year ago. That means that everybody has that capability to, like, that auto deploy platform variable could be different based on each environment. I think the challenge with the way that it is right now, because it's done at, if you were to do it at an include time, that can't be per environment because there's no environment in the include. That would have to be a global for the entire pipeline. But if you did it on a per job basis, and that job then has an environment declared, then that's where, like, it'd be really easy to just be like, oh, I'm staging. I set, the auto deploy platform to Kubernetes for staging, and I set it to ECS for production. And as long as it's evaluated at the job level, it would work fine.
Would it make sense though that people would use different deployments for staging and production? Isn't the whole point that staging be like production?
Well, yes and no, but think about literally our own staging and production. We've got Geo running in staging, but not running in production. We have a different deploy capability because we're trying to migrate it out. So we will, like, the idea is you test something in staging first and then make production match. But sometimes there's a sequence there that you can't avoid. The other very real possibility, though, for a lot of folks would be like review apps. I might have review apps go to Heroku because who cares how close they are? I just want to see what the app looks like. But then production might be, you know, a VM somewhere or any other number of ways to do it. Production often is very different from review apps. I agree that staging and production in general should be pretty close. And maybe there's lots of other ways to solve that, which is another reason I guess I'm saying, if you want to relax that constraint for 13.0, go ahead, right? Because it's not going to be a totally common one. And if you can say Auto DevOps suddenly supports this, but doesn't support this edge case, it'll be fine. Somebody wants to support this edge case, they can fork the damn project or write their own scripts or do whatever. Like, there's lots of, like, for those 5% or less of the people, they can do something custom. Auto DevOps doesn't have to solve everything. But I also believe that the solution isn't that hard, that if you just make the job conditional based on these variables and just allow multiple jobs to succeed, one of the challenges then would be you still have to make sure that, like, I like this declaration here of auto deploy platform because it's a single variable, whereas one of the other suggestions out there had like ECS deployment enabled and Kubernetes enabled, in which case then both can be enabled at the same time, and then the job gets confused and whichever one is declared last wins. And that's probably a failure mode you don't really want to go in. Although, you know, maybe that's okay too, again, if you want to relax constraints, because I also had suggested earlier, like, wouldn't it be great if we just auto-detected? Like, if the cluster is available, deploy to Kubernetes. If ECS variables are there, deploy to ECS. And then that way, like, maybe I would even just hide my Kubernetes variables from production, because you can do that as well. The challenge then, though, is if you declare that up higher, like if a group has a Kubernetes cluster available, then there's no way to override that. I would just always end up deploying to the Kubernetes cluster because the variable's available. So you got to think through a lot of these edge cases, but they're really not that hard. But you do have to think through what, like, the solution isn't hard. The thinking through might be hard.
So I think there's also another really good advantage for this variable, like the auto deploy platform or the one that we introduced, the launch type. So our solution heavily relies on the fact that you're using AWS types of variables and environment variables, and that's not always the practice. Right. People are using like different ways to pass their secrets. So this actually gives us flexibility in the future to integrate with other like vaults. You like not necessarily.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because for now, if Auto DevOps only supports those variables, that doesn't really matter. But if you want to make Auto DevOps support Vault and other things, that might be more convoluted, and maybe it's not just a matter of simply detecting a variable. You don't necessarily want to ping Vault and wait for an error to then find out, yes, you don't have vaults. Like, yeah. So I think, again, this is a perfectly valid answer. There are probably some other ramifications which we aren't necessarily going to be able to foresee. Like, I don't know. I guess I had made a request that, like, oh, if we can just auto detect everything, that'd be nice. But screw it. Like, as a first iteration, don't. And then, you know, and then maybe if you really want, at some point you could say, like, if auto deploy platform equals Kubernetes, or if the Kubernetes cluster variables are set, and then that way, you know, you support both cases. And that allows me to override it for any given, for environment, I can override it, but if not, then we'll auto detect. That could be a perfectly valid iteration, but that's also not a requirement for 13.0. But if it turns out to be a problem, you could do that. But one challenge here, though, is you've got to think about, what about everybody who already has Auto DevOps and they already have Kubernetes and they haven't set any variable? What do you do how do you do with the default if the variable isn't set?
We thought about that, and we decided that we are not going to require anyone to go back and enter these variables. A blank entry would be Kubernetes as a default. And we're going to add to the logs like a line that says you haven't set this variable, so that people get aware of it. And at some point in the future, I believe it'll be a requirement, but that's not now.
Okay. So then the only thing I would caution there is, you know, you'll just have to think it through. It's not a big deal, but Like the default for most people is actually that there is no deploy platform, because most Auto DevOps doesn't have a cluster or anything. So it has to sort of be like, well, if you've got a cluster and you have not set a platform explicitly, then the implicit type of deploy is Kubernetes. But you've obviously got to, whatever, just make sure you don't fail. Like have a bunch of people start running deploy to Kubernetes that don't exist. But yes, I'm sure that can be figured out.
So I would like to jump on like 2 comments that you made, Mark.
Yeah.
So you said that, we don't want to like end up in a path where afterwards we're cornered and that it's hard to get back out of. I still have the concern that the use of CI variable that we're intending for this iteration and maybe moving forward might be the case for that. To me, a CI variable is like something that drives the job, right? But it shouldn't be seen maybe as something, as a switch, right? That we are like, and that's what we do today. We have this CI variable and we are gonna set the value ECS for that launch type CI variable. And we use the CI variable more as a switch rather than, I don't know, something that can be used within a job. A switch as in like, we're gonna do this set of jobs or that set of jobs. And then you made the comment of later on, maybe we won't have people deploying their review apps onto a Heroku and maybe production onto something else or whatever, right? And to me, all of this, that begs for like something which I was talking about at the beginning, but it's still brewing in my head, having more of a framework, right? Having some sort of like, well, just like we have like clusters, platform, Kubernetes class, maybe we would have an ECS class, and having more like all this logic, which is like ECS related, embedded in database, and then if we have some sort of backend, then maybe we would have some front end where we have switches, where we have like, hey, we can say that you have like multiple platforms that we can deploy to. Choose the platform you want for review or for production or for Canary or whatever. And I just have like some concerns. They may be not fully formulated in my head, but I'm starting to have some concerns about the use of CI variables for what we are trying to achieve here. And I just want to make sure that it is a path we will be able to extract ourselves from, should the time come when we want to build a framework.
So I'm not quite sure how to answer your concerns, but some of the things that came up when you were talking there is, one simple analysis, like right now there's 2 things. And so it's really easy, right? What happens when there are 50 deploy targets? And some of those deploy targets are like third-party managed deploy targets. How does this extend? If I look at, GitHub Actions or Circle CI Orbs or any of these kinds of things, they all have a marketplace in a way to have lots and lots of different deploy targets. How would we want to support that kind of a thing? In that case, I don't know that a variable is a problem. Setting your auto deploy platform to a name and having that key be unique amongst all the deploy targets seems perfectly reasonable, I still would argue. It even lets you potentially override it if I want to load my own Heroku deploy target, and so I've got a custom one. I could still say my deploy platform is Heroku, but I just do a different include, and it would load different things. At some point, the Auto DevOps script gets a little crazy, and you might want to make it more dynamic, where somehow, and we have no capability to do this today, but maybe you'd dynamically generate the list of includes based on what patterns are set in the environment. Or at some point, maybe you even push it down a level. And part of my original design for includes was that you could actually potentially include them at the job level instead of at the top level. And then that way, you'd be able to do something like, well, if I've only included Heroku and Kubernetes, then those are the only includes that get loaded. Otherwise, I don't load the rest of the 50, because that would get to really, really bloated pretty soon. Anyway, I feel like, though, going down the current path doesn't stop us from going down any of the other paths. Usually, so one of the tests I use for like, okay, are we going to be painted in a corner, is come up with some crazy ideas or futures, right? And then just see, is there a possible world where we can get out of that corner? As long as you can come up with a reasonable solution where you get out of the corner, then don't design for it today, but have some confidence that, yeah, we can get around there. So I feel like having a variable, I don't see any reasons that having a single variable for the platform would cause a problem.
I don't think either. I think it's just I have this concern, but I think it would be possible to get out of this corner too. I just wanted to voice that concern.
Right. And the other angle to look at that is it possible to, okay, well, later on we have a migration that takes all these variables and we rename it to some other variable or we do something else. I mean, that's a relatively straightforward thing. So I think you'd be able to migrate away if you really wanted to kill the use of a variable. I don't feel like the use of a variable is particularly problematic. Whereas if you wanted to say, look, we'll auto detect it based on the variables that you've set. So if you set your Kubernetes variables, then we assume Kubernetes. You set your ECS variables, we assume ECS. You set them both, I don't know, we pick one. If you even went down that path, it would still be easy to get out of it if that turned out to be a bad path, because then you introduce the variable. So I think the only thing that by introducing the variable, actually, I would argue that it's still not even that bad, because at some point we talked about, you have a default. So if you don't set the variable, then we interpolate. So I feel like none of these are locking us into a corner or constraining us in any way. So just pick, something that's reasonable, that sounds good, that is a good developer experience. We're over time, but I feel like we should talk about one thing, because you asked me and I didn't respond about the dynamic pipelines. I feel like it's worthwhile explaining my comment there a little bit. Just to expose really quickly, I was actually pretty much against including dynamic pipelines from the beginning. Not necessarily because it's a bad idea, it's actually a great idea, but it actually pretty much this exact scenario where because if you have dynamic pipelines, then people will start to use that as a default. And I don't want it to use it as an excuse for basically making things really, really complex. I feel like dynamic pipelines are a very advanced feature, which we should not include by default in Auto DevOps. We should not be encouraging, frankly, people to use. It's an escape hatch for when we haven't designed the system well enough to be able to do what they need. I believe that everything that a user wants to be able to do, we should be able to do without dynamic pipelines. But there's a timeliness of it, where if it takes us a year to implement a feature that they need and they could get it done on dynamic pipelines, then great. That gives them an escape hatch to do that for the year until we introduce, the feature that they really need. But everything that we should be doing should be at the top level. Like Shinya's suggestion to have, conditional includes. Like that's a great example where that's a first-class way to solve the problem. In the meantime, you could use dynamic pipelines, and as a customer, if that's what you have to do, then go ahead and use dynamic pipelines. But for us, I would really just hate to see Auto DevOps, because Auto DevOps is supposed to be our embodiment of best practices. And I'll just say it, dynamic pipelines are not a best practice. They are an escape hatch that just adds a massive complexity, like technical complexity, but also cognitive complexity. If I look at that pipeline, I no longer know what it does because I'm doing a wget to find a file, where it's like, why don't I just do an include? And it's like, oh, well, because we have rules for it. And that's the only reason. It's clearly a hack. We're trying to do basically an include with conditions but include doesn't have conditions. And anybody reading that would be like, well, why don't you just make includes have conditions? Just do it as a first-class way, not as a hack to work around a limitation. So again, if you needed to experiment for one iteration and you needed to do it this way to get it out, and then the next iteration you wanted to, then you push includes to have conditions, that's totally fine as a temporary solution. But I just really don't believe it's a permanent, because it's not a best practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
So
anything else?
It's a go for 13.0 with our current proposal, correct? I do think we need some follow-up issues like the conditional includes, which is really an interesting use case regardless to Auto DevOps. And then I think we pretty much thought about the default values and the conditions. But when we expand this to be even bigger, then we'll need to rethink, all the logic again. It's probably going to be in the near future, but
yeah, I mean, I really hope we have multiple deploy targets. I also really hope that whatever we do here becomes a pattern for people to add their own deploy targets and like take the Auto DevOps template, put it in their GitLab CI YAML, and then be like, oh, I'm just going to include my own definition of how to do deploys. And then suddenly I've got to deploy to, my own custom stack, but all the rest of Auto DevOps still works. And then, that would be the ideal outcome. So the only thing that you said that we're okay with the current proposal, but technically when I look at the issue, the proposal is pretty light. It doesn't actually say any of the details we just talked about.
Yeah.
So I don't know what the actual proposal is, especially since there's like 5 competing proposals in the comments.
So
I believe we're on the same page, but you please go and update the issue to actually describe what the proposal is.
I'll recap just so that we're all on the same page. So the idea is we're using this new launch type that is going to help the logic of Auto DevOps to decide which template to use in terms of the include. And then,
but let's be more clear. All the templates are going to be included, but you're saying to choose which job to use.
Which job to use. And the jobs are going to be renamed. So we're going to have a job called deploy Kubernetes and deploy ECS and the review app accordingly. And that's the job that's going to be chosen based on the logic of the launch type.
Yep.
That's it.
So launch type is the variable, not deploy platform, or whatever it was called. Oh, see, this is the thing. So right now, the only variable I've seen is AWS launch type, which feels, it's obviously AWS specific. Is that the actual proposal you're going with?
I named it Auto DevOps AWS launch type. The prefix of Auto DevOps came from someone said, hey, instead of using CI or no prefix, use Auto DevOps as a prefix. Some sort of like, I don't know, something that that looks like a best practice of some sort. So yeah, Auto DevOps AWS.
Yeah, it's debatable whether that's a best practice,
yeah,
but I'm fine with that if it's Auto DevOps specific.
What about this one, Etienne? I think this one is better.
Auto deploy platform?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm just going to throw out a couple things. One is the one you said, Etienne, still had AWS in it. And so that implies, well, like, yeah, but I'm deploying outside of AWS. I'm not going to set that. So then what do? I'm not quite sure. I'm not saying it doesn't work, but it sounds like you're implying stuff. But by saying Auto DevOps platform, you're being explicit. Yeah. And I'm making a choice between all these other choices. The other thing is that when you talk about launch type as ECS, are there other values that launch type could be? Like, can I do an AWS deploy outside of ECS?
We will.
EC2?
We will.
Okay, so that's where things get tricky. So you're making a variable that sounds very specific, but actually has no other values other than like ECS or null. And again, right. I would think that the auto deploy platform would be the right place, because then it's between Kubernetes, it's EC2, it's ECS, it's whatever. It's just one variable instead of like a 2-tiered variable. Like, oh, first I have to, am I deploying to AWS? Oh, then within AWS, which one am I deploying to? I could see potentially reasons to do that, but none of them, are relevant right now. The only other thing, so I want a comment to make is auto deploy. You had said a couple conflicting things. So right now this says auto deploy, but auto DevOps is the thing. Auto deploy is a part of auto DevOps. So you've got to make some decision about whether you want it to be auto deploy or auto DevOps. The other thing I'm going to suggest is, like, do you really need to do anything with auto DevOps at all, or any auto anything? What if you just called it deploy platform? And the reason I'm suggesting that is, again, as a best practice, you're sort of actually being a little conservative and saying, well, we want auto DevOps to be this other thing that isn't actually what you really use. So if you use it, then the variables don't conflict or whatever. But I kind of like the idea of saying, well, but if I took auto DevOps and then I modified it and made it my thing, and it's no longer auto DevOps because it's no longer, I've got a hard-coded GitLab CI YAML, what variable am I going to use then? And now you're perpetuating, and I'm going to have a variable calling Auto DevOps platform. And it's like, that's weird. This isn't Auto DevOps anymore. And that's a weird sort of philosophical thing of like, what is Auto DevOps? Is Auto DevOps literally that one YAML, or is it something else.
I agree, totally agree with Mark. I think in a path where we want to do composable auto DevOps and basically make this Lego that anyone can build their own, I think we should refrain from auto DevOps. So I would even agree that the deploy platform is better than auto deploy platform.
Right. Right. Now, I mean, auto deploy platform has a potential there, and you can say, well, I'm not using auto DevOps, but I am using auto deploy. But auto deploy, like, barely. I know we have a doc page on it. It does exist as a term, but it's not really. Calling it deploy platform could be a challenge, and in a variety of other ways. You know, it's making a bolder statement though, and saying, look, no, this is how you declare anything. And even if you want to write your own, this is what we suggest you do. You would make your own deploy platform, you'd call it something else, and you'd write your own script, but that's just what you would call it, deploy platform. Or the term I use is actually deploy target. I'm not saying that's a mandatory term either, but you might want to think about what's the generic best practice if this wasn't auto DevOps, and then sort of just take that on.
Yeah, so we started with launch type, which is AWS's way, like to say ECS or EC2 or Fairgate or others.
Right. Right. Anyway, to be clear, I'm not opposed to any, like if you want to put auto DevOps, you want to put auto deploy, it's fine. I would just encourage you to think through the ramifications and the principles around it of, you know, either if you want to say, look, everything should be behind auto DevOps. Like, I don't know if the rest of our variables all have auto DevOps, but I'm pretty sure when we set things like how many pods to scale up, we didn't use auto DevOps prefixed variables. We declared this is the variable, like this is how many, I don't remember the size is, something like that. And I think to be consistent, I'm pretty sure we don't prefix everything with auto DevOps or auto deploy or auto anything. I could be wrong though, it's been a while. Anybody happen to have a link to our variables used in auto DevOps?
I feel like we can decide on the name asynchronously, and we can all.
Very true.
And I think we can conclude this this meeting.
Yeah. So just really quickly looking through though, like we've got like kube ingress. It's not auto DevOps kube ingress. It's, you know, these are other terms. So I don't think we use auto DevOps as a prefix for anything else. But all right. Anyway, thanks. Hopefully the meeting was useful for everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks. Ciao.